When my phone vibrated on Thursday afternoon at 10 minutes past 4, I knew what the message would say. Still, I opened it anyway. It was, as expected from my private investigator. The text read, "She's been served." My wife, Whitney Emerson, held many titles: wife, mother, sister, daughter, friend. But she was also a senior partner at Willington and Compton, a highly respected law firm in the Hartford area. Among her duties as a senior partner was managing the workload of 7 junior partners. She conducted 2 mandatory meetings each week, Monday mornings at 10 o'clock and Thursday afternoons at 4 o'clock sharp. These meetings always began precisely on time, and anyone arriving late endured Whitney's ire for the duration of the session. It was during one of these Thursday meetings, just 2 minutes past 4, that a sheriff entered the conference room to serve the divorce papers. Following my instructions, he stood firm and addressed her formally. "Mrs. Emerson, your husband is filing for divorce. You've officially been served." After 23 years of marriage, I knew my wife well. Being served in front of her subordinates would be a public humiliation she would struggle to process. Though anger would burn inside her, Whitney wouldn't rush home. Instead, she'd retreat to her office, close the door, and meticulously scrutinize every word of the divorce petition. Just as any skilled attorney would, her first reading of the legal document was bound to be perplexing. I had listed the generic, irreconcilable differences as the reason for the divorce. On the surface, this would relieve Whitney, as it didn't mention her long-term affair with Clark Tucker, a 29-year-old associate at her firm, who also happened to be married. Yet, she would undoubtedly suspect I knew about the affair. The division of assets would leave her even more puzzled. According to the petition, we would sell our 7,300-square-foot home and our summer property on the Connecticut shoreline, splitting the proceeds. Each of us would retain our respective retirement accounts, while our banking and checking accounts would be divided after paying off debts. Since both of us earned substantial incomes, alimony wasn't necessary. However, the real confusion would set in when she realized that my third-generation engineering firm, a highly profitable venture, wasn't mentioned anywhere in the document. Whitney was familiar with my divorce attorney's reputation, having even recommended her services to friends in the past. She often referred to her as a shark. That same reputation would now leave Whitney questioning how such a respected attorney could have overlooked a business of this magnitude. She would suspect foul play but wouldn't immediately know what I was planning. After carefully rereading the petition to confirm that her lover, Clark Tucker, wasn't explicitly named, Whitney would likely summon her most trusted partners and associates for an emergency meeting. Together, they would dissect the papers, trying to develop an initial strategy for dealing with her supposedly timid husband, me. My name is Nathan Emerson. I met Whitney when she was in her second year of law school at the University of Connecticut, while I was completing my PhD in mechanical engineering. We started dating a week after we met and quickly became exclusive. On our third date, after a delightful dinner, she surprised me by saying, "Nathan, let's go back to your apartment." That weekend, we grew closer than ever. Our connection felt electric, and we couldn't get enough of each other. Over time, we explored life together, building what I believed was a deep, meaningful bond. We agreed early on to remain exclusive and committed to one another. Our wedding, 2 weeks after we both received our advanced degrees, cemented this promise. The ceremony was a grand affair, held in Whitney's hometown of Portland, Maine, with a reception set under elegant tents along the rocky coastline. It was a picture-perfect day, one we carried in our hearts as we began our life together. Our honeymoon in Aruba was equally unforgettable, filled with laughter, love, and dreams of the future. Shortly after our return, Whitney secured a position at Willington and Compton, where she began to rise through the ranks. I took over our family business, eventually purchasing my father's shares when he retired 12 years ago. Over the next 2 decades, we built a life filled with love, raised 2 remarkable children, and balanced the demands of career and family. Whitney's hard work paid off when she was promoted to junior partner at her law firm, a milestone we celebrated with pride. But here we were now, 23 years later, unraveling the life we had built. 7 years into her career, Whitney was thriving, and by year 16, she had ascended to the role of senior partner. Life was nearly perfect, until the day everything began to unravel. It all started just over 3 years ago, when an anonymous letter arrived at my office. The envelope was addressed to me, with the words "personal and confidential" scrawled across the bottom. Inside, a folded piece of notebook paper held a brief, devastating message. Your wife is in love with Clark Tucker. Attached was a grainy photo of Whitney and Clark standing in the doorway of what appeared to be a rundown motel. I didn't act impulsively. Instead, I hired a highly recommended private investigator to confirm the claim. Within 2 months, I had a mountain of evidence: photos, videos, dates, and locations, all documenting Whitney's infidelity. It was grotesque in its thoroughness. For the next month, I played the role of a devoted husband, masking my growing disdain while carefully plotting my next move. I assembled a team: my private investigator, my divorce attorney, my business attorney, and my personal accountant. At our first meeting, I laid out my vision, emphasizing that this might take years to execute. Their job was to ensure every step I took was entirely legal, leaving nothing that could be used against me in the divorce proceedings. On the same Thursday afternoon Whitney was served, I received a second text from my private investigator at 10 minutes to 6. Clark Tucker has been served. 2 weeks earlier, the investigator had met with Rachel Tucker, Clark's wife, and provided her with an exhaustive report of her husband's affair with Whitney. This included the full 3 years of evidence: photos, videos, and documentation. He also recommended my divorce attorney to Rachel, who eagerly enlisted her help. I imagined whatever legal strategy Whitney's team at Willington and Compton had devised to counter my divorce petition was immediately derailed. Rachel's petition cited infidelity as the reason for divorce, and included the complete report prepared by my investigator. That evening, at 10 minutes past 8, the garage door rumbled. 4 hours had passed since Whitney was served, and I silently wondered if my 3 years of planning would outmaneuver whatever emergency strategy she and her legal team had scrambled to create. I was seated at the head of our 10-person dining room table. The chairs on either side had been removed, leaving only one chair at the opposite end, where I had placed a glass of Whitney's favorite red wine. As I heard the door from the garage to the kitchen open, followed by Whitney's familiar call, I took a measured sip of my slightly chilled bourbon. The sharp rhythm of her heels on the tiled floor grew louder as she moved through the house, checking the family room, my office, and the living room before finally stepping into the dining room. She stood in the archway, surveying the stripped-down table and my chosen seat at its head. Without a word, she moved to the far end, sat down, and reached for the wine. Lifting the glass, she toasted me. "Thanks for the wine," she said, taking a long sip. Several beats of silence passed before she finally spoke. "I don't want a divorce." "I know," I replied, my voice firm, "and I don't want a cheating woman for a wife." "Nathan, please," she implored, "let's talk like adults. Yes, I've had an affair, but that doesn't make me a cheating woman." I raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Really? You've told me countless times over the years that only a cheating woman would let a man have her like that. Those were your words, Whitney." I didn't need to elaborate further. She knew exactly what I meant. Her face flushed red, her breathing shallow as she fought to control herself. She exhaled slowly, calming the visible storm within. "Why did you have to destroy Clark's family? He has 2 wonderful children who will now grow up without a father at home," she said, her voice sharp. I couldn't suppress a dry chuckle. Shaking my head, I replied calmly, "Have you met Rachel Tucker? She's a knockout. Her kids will have a new father soon enough, and I'm betting he won't be a lying cheat like your lover." I let the words hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "Why should I care about his family? He didn't give a damn about mine or you." Whitney clenched her jaw, her frustration boiling over. "I've politely asked you to speak to me like an adult. This language isn't helping." I allowed myself a small, deliberate smile, one I knew would unsettle her. "Whitney, I'm not trying to help the situation. If you don't like what I have to say, you can get up and leave. I promise you, on everything holy, I won't stop you." Predictably, she stayed seated. "How long have you known?" she asked, her voice quieter but no less tense. Instead of answering, I reached for one of the items I had prepared before her arrival. It was a copy of the anonymous letter that had been sent to my office 3 years ago. Sliding it across the table toward her, I leaned back in my chair, watching her reaction. Whitney pulled the letter and photo from the envelope, her eyes scanning every detail. After carefully examining them, she glanced at the envelope, taking note of the postmark. Her voice broke the silence. "You've known for 3 years, and you didn't do anything." I chuckled at her naivety. "Believe me, Whitney, I've done plenty. You had a 4-hour meeting at work today to prepare for this conversation. I've had 3 years to prepare, I said, my voice rising as I finished. Her expression shifted, a flicker of genuine concern crossing her face. I wasn't ready to delve into that just yet, so I pressed on. For example, we haven't been intimate since I found out. Other than the occasional peck on the cheek, there's been almost no physical contact. It's been 3 years since we've even shared a real hug. And the saddest part? You didn't even notice. Her face softened with guilt. I thought you'd lost interest in love, she murmured. That comment made me laugh, loud and harsh. Oh, I lost interest in love, all right. With you, I replied, my voice cutting through the air. Whitney hesitated, her gaze steady yet searching. Have you really gone 3 years without intimacy? She asked cautiously. A wide grin spread across my face. Without intimacy with you? Absolutely. But otherwise, let's just say I've had plenty of fulfilling experiences. And judging by the videos I've seen, I've enjoyed my partners far more than you've enjoyed yours. The shock on her face was unmistakable as she leaned back in her chair, struggling to process my words. I didn't stop. The difference, Whitney, is that I have proof, video proof of your escapades. You don't have a shred of evidence against me. Her voice cracked with desperation. Nathan, I love you. I always have. My time with Clark meant nothing. It was just a way to relieve stress, especially after you stopped being close to me. Don't even try that, I shot back, my tone unwavering. Your ongoing, weekly 3-year affair is entirely on you. Don't you dare shift the blame to me. Whitney sat in silence for a moment, visibly attempting to collect herself. When she spoke again, her voice was quieter, almost pleading. Regardless, I love you, and I know you love me. You're wrong, Whitney, I said firmly. For 3 years, you've lied to me, broken our wedding vows, and humiliated me in ways I never imagined. It took time for my love to fade, but now, I don't even like you anymore. The tears she had tried so hard to contain finally spilled over as she jumped to her feet and ran from the room. I didn't follow. I knew she'd return, likely angrier and more determined. Sure enough, Whitney came back after changing into jeans and a blouse, her movements sharp and deliberate. She refilled her wine glass from the bottle I'd left at her end of the table. Nathan, I think you need to rethink your approach. I've got a strong team at work, and with the help of an outside divorce attorney, you stand to lose a lot. I've already noticed some glaring mistakes in the petition Sabrina Brown prepared. If we can't come to an agreement, I'll have my team come after you full force. Her confidence wavered as I smiled, my amusement clearly unsettling her. That's the difference between your team and mine, Whitney, I replied calmly. Your team is just getting started. My team, however, has been working on this for 3 years. Your war begins tomorrow, but mine is already over. I paused, letting my words sink in before continuing. You say you love me, and I'll take you at your word, though I'm not sure how that's possible after 3 years of deceit. Still, I'll accept that you love me. By the time this divorce is finalized, though, I can almost guarantee you'll hate me. And here's the kicker. Everything you'll hate me for has already happened. You just don't know it yet. Whitney's face twisted in frustration as she lashed out. You'll never be able to turn our kids against me, she shouted. I'd never try to turn the kids against you, I replied evenly. In fact, I haven't even spoken to them yet. I plan to call them this weekend, along with both sets of parents and our siblings. I'll tell them I've filed for divorce because of your long-term affair. I'll encourage them to treat you with respect and maintain their relationships with you. But ultimately, it's their choice. If anyone doubts the depth of your betrayal, I'll offer to share the investigator's report. My guess is you won't want that to happen, so you might want to confirm your affair when they ask. Whitney's control was slipping, and she knew it. Instead of backing down, she exploded. I'll take your company away from you, she screamed. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Her ace in the hole was nothing more than a losing hand. What company? I asked innocently. Her confusion was obvious. Precision engineering, she sneered. I'm going to take it over. I grinned, the expression lingering as I responded. Sweetheart, don't you remember? We sold precision engineering to the Swedes 2 years ago. That's illegal. The company is a family asset, and I never agreed to the sale, she countered, her voice shaking. You're right, Whitney. You didn't agree to it, I said, my tone dripping with mock sincerity. But you did grant me a very broad power of attorney for all matters related to the company. In fact, your firm drafted the document. I used that power of attorney to finalize the sale and invest the proceeds in overseas accounts. You signed off on all our family tax documents, which clearly outlined the sale and the movement of funds. That was 2 years ago. Good luck trying to track it down now. Whitney sat frozen, her mouth moving soundlessly like a fish out of water. Without another word, I stood, left the room, and went upstairs to the guest room. Locking the door behind me, I sat on the edge of the bed and let the weight of it all finally hit me. For the first time in years, I cried. At 3 in the morning, my alarm went off. I showered, dressed, and left for the airport, ready to catch my flight to Florida. In preparation for my single life, I had purchased a condo on Clearwater Beach, just across the bay from Tampa. That decision, along with many others, had shocked Whitney on that pivotal night. What she didn't yet realize was how much more there was to uncover. I estimated it would take her legal team a few weeks of meticulous document analysis to comprehend that the nearly $34 million from the sale of Precision Engineering had never touched a U.S. bank. Because of this, it would remain entirely outside the jurisdiction of our divorce settlement. But that was only half of my plan. The other half was set to unfold 5 weeks later, on the Friday after Thanksgiving. If family traditions were anything to go by, this part of my strategy would truly leave its mark. Whitney had always been exceptionally close to her maternal grandmother, Denise. When she was younger, Denise planned weekly outings just for the two of them. As the years passed and Denise aged, Whitney took over the planning. For the last several years, Whitney had made monthly trips to Portland, Maine, to visit Denise at her assisted living facility. They'd share lunch, and if Denise felt well, they'd spend time at the mall. One of the most cherished family traditions, started by Denise and upheld by Whitney for the past 15 years, was the annual display of a nearly 175-year-old nativity scene. Every year on the Friday after Thanksgiving, Whitney would visit our local bank to retrieve the 24 figurines, each meticulously stored in its own velvet-lined box from a large safety deposit box. That same day, the kids and I would set out to pick 2 12-foot Nathantmas trees. Decorating our home was an all-day affair. The centerpiece was always the nativity scene, arranged on a straw-covered table flanked by the 2 trees. Rows of poinsettias lined the table, serving as a barrier to keep our guests' wandering hands away from the delicate figurines. Once everything was in place, Whitney would stand before the nativity scene, tears streaming down her face as she reflected on its significance. She often admitted that the display was her happy place, a reminder of the joys of her past and present. Throughout the holiday season, she'd become emotional each time she saw it, overwhelmed by the memories it evoked. After the holidays, we followed a strict routine. On the last day of vacation, the decorations would come down, and Whitney would carefully box up each figurine, placing them on the kitchen counter. The next morning, on her way to work, she'd return them to the safety deposit box until the following year. Most of my plans for divorcing Whitney had been set in motion during the first year after I discovered her affair. Only one part took all 3 years to finalize. In the last 3 years, I had established a tradition of my own. Each New Year's Day, I scheduled a business trip that required a noon departure. On those mornings, Whitney and I had breakfast together, and I'd help her load the boxed figurines into her car before she left for the bank. But last year, everything changed. As we were getting dressed, Whitney looked across the room and asked, "Nathan, can you do me a favor?" "Sure," I replied, curious. "I've got a mountain of work waiting for me this morning. Do you have time to take the figurines to the bank before heading to the airport?" she asked. I paused, then smiled. "That'll be easy enough. I'll take care of it." Fast forward to this year, the Friday after Thanksgiving. As expected, Whitney's text arrived right on schedule, and it was as fiery as I had anticipated. "Whitney, where the hell are my figurines, you jerk?" Her rage was so amusing that I laughed so hard coffee shot out of my nose. Grace, my 38-year-old divorced neighbor, happened to walk past my bedroom at that moment and caught the spectacle. She burst into laughter along with me. "Do you need to answer that text, or do you have a little time for me before I head out?" she teased, her tone playful. We'd already spent time together earlier that morning, but Grace's allure and expertise had a way of making it easy to say yes. After a quick shower, she dressed, kissed me goodbye, and left for her place. Once she was gone, I finally picked up my phone to review the texts and missed calls. Whitney had been relentless. Along with her frantic messages were several from her family members and even our kids. I had no desire to speak to Whitney, but I decided it was easier to call her than to respond to everyone else who had reached out. When she answered her phone, her tone was sharp and full of anger. "What the hell took you so long to call back?" she hissed. "I was with one of my neighbors, Whitney," I said firmly, letting the words hang in the air. Whitney took a moment to calm herself before continuing. "I want my nativity scene back, and I want it now." "Sure," I replied casually. "Go to the bank and get it." Her voice grew more agitated. "Nathan, I know you didn't take the figurines back to the bank last year. The last recorded access to the safety deposit box was when I removed them for Nathantmas. You agreed to take them to the bank for me. Please, Nathan, just give me my treasures back," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, Whitney, but you're mistaken," I said coolly. "I clearly remember putting the boxes in the trunk of your car before you left for work, just like every other year." "What are you trying to pull?" she asked, her tone trembling. Whitney began to sob. "Oh God, why are you doing this to me? I know you're angry, but why would you do something so cruel?" I didn't waver. "It's amazing how you refuse to take responsibility for the mess you've made of your life. Goodbye, Whitney." I ended the call. Instead of letting her accusations linger, I reached out to everyone who had called me. I gave them a consistent message. Whitney was trying to stir up trouble as our court date approached. Whether they believed me or not didn't matter. I was certain no one had any proof that I still had the figurines. 14 months after I filed, the divorce was finalized. Whitney fought tooth and nail, throwing up legal roadblocks at every turn. She even involved the police and insurance investigators in an effort to track down her missing nativity scene. My only statement on the matter was simple. As I recall, I put all 24 boxes of figurines into the trunk of Whitney's car. It didn't matter if anyone doubted me. There was no evidence to prove otherwise. Over the years, Whitney and I saw each other occasionally at events hosted by our children. We remained polite but distant. 14 years after our divorce, I learned from our daughter that Whitney was losing her battle with an aggressive form of breast cancer. As her time grew short, my daughter called and asked if I would visit her mother. When I arrived at Whitney's hospice room the next day, she was asleep. I stood by her bed, watching her in silence as memories flooded my mind. The emotions were overwhelming, and I had to fight back tears more than once. Lost in thought, I didn't notice when she stirred. "You were right, you know," Whitney said softly, her voice drawing me back to the present. I looked at her, startled but smiling. Of course I was right. But just out of curiosity, what are we talking about? Her smile faltered for a moment. "You told me that my love for you would turn to hate by the end of the divorce. After everything I did to you and our family, I'm ashamed to admit it, but I hated you for a long time." "Right back at you, Whitney," I replied with a small laugh. Her smile returned, and for a brief moment, it felt like old times. "Nathan, do you still hate me?" I thought for a moment before answering. "No, hate takes too much energy, and I didn't have the strength to hold on to it for long. How about you?" Whitney nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. "I agree. After a while, hate just isn't worth the effort." We spent the next 2 hours reminiscing, sharing stories about our children and happier times. At some point, Whitney drifted off to sleep again. My first instinct was to leave, but I reconsidered. This would likely be the last time I'd ever see her. When she woke, we continued talking and even laughing, just as we had years ago. We were mid-conversation when our son Derek, his wife Hannah, and their 3 children walked in. I could see the relief on Derek's face when he saw me there with his mother. I didn't stay much longer, wanting Derek and his family to have time with Whitney. As I said my goodbyes, I leaned down and gave her a soft kiss on the lips. "Nathan," she called as I turned toward the door. "Can I ask you a favor?" I nodded. "Of course." Whitney looked at Derek and said, "Would you mind giving your dad and me a moment alone?" Derek and Hannah quickly gathered their kids and stepped out. Once we were alone, Whitney continued, "I'd like Derek's family and Diana's family to alternate displaying the nativity scene at Nathantmas. Do you think you can help make that happen?" The Friday after Thanksgiving, while many families were out chasing holiday sales, my family gathered at my daughter Diana's home. Together with Derek and his family, we spent the day decorating. Candles and wreaths adorned the windows, lights wrapped around the bushes in the front yard, and Nathantmas knickknacks filled every room on the first floor. The centerpiece of our efforts was in Diana's family room. Between 2 towering 12-foot Nathantmas trees, we set up a straw-covered table, 3 rows of poinsettias were carefully placed in front as a protective barrier, and on the table sat the 24 figurines of Whitney's cherished nativity scene. Before leaving that evening, Derek, Diana, and I stood together, taking one last look at the display. Tears rolled down my cheeks as I remembered Whitney standing before the same nativity scene years ago, her eyes filled with emotion as she called it her happy place.